Hi, you're welcome to my short course on principle-oriented paradigm. Today we shall be talking about the significance of principles to building a sustainable success. No doubt about the fact that generally in life, principle has a major role to play when it comes to attaining success. And I wouldn't say sad to say, but the point is there are instances in which many of us often close high to the significance of paradigm when it comes to sustaining success over a long period of time. So today we're going to talk about the principles, impact, and success, and how best one can utilize or one can develop the right principle towards sustainable success over the long period of time. So first, when we talk of paradigm simply describes one's outlook about life. That is, it could simply be described as a lens through which one sees life generally. That's why when you bring in two, three people together to give opinion about a specific subject, you realize they have diverse views. They could have diverse views about a specific subject, and that has to do with their outlook about the scenario or whatever it is they are actually examining. But meanwhile, in real life scenarios, in day-to-day activities, you realize paradigm shapes actions and it as well shapes one's emotions. So today we're going to see how best one could develop the right paradigm and how best one could examine his or her paradigm to be sure that the paradigm in which he operates on is a paradigm that will project him or project her towards sustainable success in such a way that at a later time, when he reflected back on his success, he can be sure that he have actually operated on the right paradigms that shaped his success in the right path. Towards a sustainable success. First, when we talk of paradigm, in the context of this course, paradigm is described in three different categories. The first of it has to do with concave paradigm. And this is a paradigm in which those who actually live from that paradigm perspective, they tend to focus much more on the advantage of whatever it is they are doing. That is, let's assume they want to make a decision. The major focus has to do with this advantage, immediate advantage, that is the immediate benefit of that decision. More like satisfying their gratifications or more like satisfying their curiosity. I wouldn't say curiosity, but more like satisfying, I would say satisfying their gratifications at that point in time. And they don't care about what the disadvantage of the decisions will be on the long time or what the disadvantage will be in the short term. So they focus majorly on the immediate the immediate advantage of their decisions. Meanwhile, on the other way around, we have the convex paradigm. Those who actually live from convex paradigm perspective, they tend to focus much more on the advantage of their decisions on the long term majorly, and perhaps to satisfy the external factors. And on the other way around, we have the optimal paradigm, and those who actually live from optimal paradigm perspective, they tend to examine situations both on the short-term advantage as well as the long-term advantage and the short-term disadvantage and the long-term disadvantage. This is what I mean. In every situation, we have the short-term and we as well have the long-term. Here we have the advantage and here we have the disadvantage. And here we have the advantage as well, and here we have the disadvantage. And basically what those who live from optimal paradigm does is they tend to examine their situations in relation to long-term, short-term advantage, short-term disadvantage, long-term advantage, and long-term disadvantage. Meanwhile, to those who actually live from concave paradigm perspective, their major focus is usually on the short-term advantage of whatever decision it is they want to make. And in major instances, they don't examine the long-term disadvantage, or perhaps in some instances, they don't examine the long-term disadvantage as well as disadvantage. And the short-term disadvantage is really in focus. And on the other way around, to those who actually live from convex paradigm perspective, what they actually do majorly is they focus on the long-term disadvantage of whatever decision it is they want to make. And in major instances, those decisions are tailored towards satisfying external factors, that is, perhaps trying to boost personal egos in one way or the other. As we proceed, we're going to see scenarios which actually bring the subject into limelight. Let's take, for instance, the concave paradigm. Imagine a scenario of two organizations, a multi-million-dollar organizations. We have two accountants who were newly recruited into the organization. And now, let's take, for instance, here is Mr. A and here is Mr. B. Both of them are accountants. They were just promoted into the positions to head the accounting of the organization. So anything revolving finances goes through both of them stable. In Mr. A, as soon as Mr. A attains such positions, he sees a lot of money and look, this is an opportunity for him to as well make money for himself. And right away, as he attains such position, his major focus is always tailored towards how he's going to benefit himself by siphoning the company's organizations and as well creating loopholes or looking for loopholes so as to be able to get money out of the organization. And Mr. B, on the other way around, as soon as he attains the position, his major focus was to see how best to keep the organization intact such a way that he would leave a legacy behind for himself. Mr. B and Mr. A, they actually attaining the same position in two respective organizations, in two different organizations, and they both are operating from different paradigm perspectives. And now Mr. A, while attaining that position, begins to siphon the organization's money. What was his focus? His major focus was the short-term advantage of having a lot of money in his account and as well be able to live a much more comfortable life beyond what is, I would say, beyond what his current take-home could actually sustain. And now he begins to focus on this short-term advantage. He rarely focuses on the disadvantage that, okay, in the interim, the organization is losing money, that is, his actions is actually costing the organization. And before he knows it, the organization might fold up, and people would lose their job. He wasn't considering those things because his major focus was on the short-term objective, that is the short-term outlook about the decision he's making. While on the other way around, Mr. B was focusing on the longer picture, that he's been able to sustain the organization financially. In short, there are instances when there are loopholes. Mr. B will go as far as closing up that loopholes so that the company wouldn't run at any loss. Now, Mr. B or Mr. A, despite the fact that he doesn't consider the short-term disadvantage of the decision he's making, he as well wouldn't consider the short-term disadvantage because, the long-term disadvantage, which includes he being caught, perhaps when the organization is running through a lot of courses, losing a lot of finances, they might have to bring in an external auditor, and in the interim, he might have to step aside so that he investigates his role within the organization. And he forgets to realize that, or to focus on the fact that when he's being caught, first he's going to lose his job, and secondly, he's going to be, they would make him return all the money which he has stolen, which more like result in effort in futility. And aside that, he could as well not think about the impact that, okay, after he has refunded all the money, he could be prosecuted and he might have to spend the rest of his life behind a cubicle, that is within the jail. So the bottom line is, when one operates from concave paradigm perspective, one tends to focus majorly on the short-term advantage of whatever decisions which one is making, and one doesn't focus on the long-term disadvantage and as well perhaps the short-term disadvantage. So that's why in instances when people operate from concave paradigm perspective, it often goes as far are sabotaging their success over the long period of time. And the objective of this course is to ensure that is to help others as well to see the significance of building the right paradigm towards sustaining success over the long period of time. And now, when you talk of convex paradigm, these are people who ordinarily, they tend to want to, the paradigm, there is a paradigm tailored towards focusing on the long-term disadvantage. I mean, the long-term advantage of whatever decisions they're making, and in major instances, they would consider the short-term advantage that isn't as much in focus as the long-term advantage. And when it comes to the disadvantage, they don't focus on the disadvantage as well on the short term and as well on the long term. So when you observe these two scenarios, the concave paradigm as well as concave paradigm and convex paradigm perspective, you realize the advantage is often out of focus for those who operate from those paradigm perspectives. Okay, let's take for instance, let's utilize an example to bring down this, to bring home this example of convex paradigm. There are instances in which you see people, conveniently their resources, I mean their take home and whatever it is they have as source of income, could conveniently build a 3-bedroom apartment in a very nice locations and well furnished to taste. And let's take part, for instance, they have their families of 3 or families of 4. In major instances, they can even build 4-bedroom flats, conveniently with the resources which they are getting. But considering the fact that the person is operating from convex paradigm perspective, he might want to look out okay because he has some colleagues who are financially well-to-do, they live in a specific area, and he wouldn't want to live in an area where his means would be able to sustain. But rather, he might want to live within those people, and he doesn't have the resources to live in such a place. And what will he do? Maybe, for instance, the money that would go ahead in building his own apartment in a moderate, I mean, very nice area that would furnish the whole thing to taste and give him a very brilliant apartment. He could use the entire money and go and use it to purchase a plot of land right in the lucrative or in the areas where the high class of people lives. Why? Because he felt, I mean, being within those people would, in one way or the other, satisfy his or her egos. And before you realize it, he might even, maybe around that areas, the buildings there are like 10-bedroom flats, duplex, and all sorts of designs. He as well would want to work towards that. And before you realize it, he might not build beyond the foundations of whatever it is he wants to achieve, because his objective is to live out of his current needs. Let's assume, to some people who operate from optimal paradigm perspective, all they have to do is they could go ahead and build these 3 or 4-bedroom flats to taste. And right away from there, if this is where they are going, they just walk towards it. They begin to, I mean, they could engage in business, legit business that would get them legit money. And before you realize it, they would conveniently be able to build here. But the point is, because the person who is operating from convex paradigm perspective is actually looking towards living here, and thus he was focusing on the long-term advantage of satisfying his egos, of living within people who are of high caliber set of people. So no doubt about the fact that optimal paradigm has a major role to play. Because to someone who is actually operating from optimal paradigm perspective, one would have to consider the short-term advantage, the long-term advantage, the short-term disadvantage, the long-term disadvantage of the decisions. No doubt about the fact that having high aspiration for oneself is very wonderful, it's something good. But in instances where one begins to sabotage his or herself solely because he wants to satisfy an external factor, then that's where the major problem comes in. And no doubt about the fact that this would affect one's ways of, this paradigm would affect not only scenarios like this, but as well in other scenarios generally across different categories of life, because it's often built, or it's a paradigm tailored towards satisfying more like an external ego, sort of, or more like satisfying, living from outside into the internal, that is seeking, I'd say, validations, and in major instances which one really doesn't get to have. But when you talk of optimal paradigm perspective, those who operate from optimal paradigm perspective would as well consider the fact that, okay, at the moment, this is what I can afford. Then they can build this, begin to work towards the longer goal, that is the objective at the long run, and conveniently, they could as well achieve that. And now, in the scenario of the two accountants we were referring to earlier, Mr. B is actually operating from optimal paradigm perspective, because even when there are opportunities for him to extort the organization's fund, he would have to consider factors, the short-term advantage. What is the advantage? You could have a lot of resources within, you could have access to much more money beyond what he's earning, but he as well would realize that there are disadvantages associated with it. And that disadvantage include him losing his job, or perhaps him spending the rest of his, spending so much of his lives behind the bar, or perhaps he being subjected to things or situations which he wouldn't love, more like an embarrassing situations, and thus he thinks about it, he reflects about that, and thus chooses to pull behind and not engage in things that would as well make him operate from any of these paradigms. And thus he begins to think about the long-term advantage as well. What is the long-term advantage? No doubt about the fact that going into an organization and sustaining the organization's finances would help him to leave behind a good legacy. And perhaps if after he left the organization, don't be surprised, in one way or the other, those within the organization might still have to come and meet him to seek for some help, perhaps in the area of consultations. Or perhaps he could want to come back and serve as consultants into the organizations. Perhaps if the organization is going through a trying period and they know his experience has a major role to play. But in the instance of Mr. He, no doubt about the fact that even if he's very intelligent in respect to things like that, but considering the fact that he operates from concave paradigm, which has actually led him into engaging in things that into him engaging in fraudulent activities, would in one way or the other not make him leave behind a good legacy. And no one within the organization of Mr. He will want to go back to Mr. He and say, we really want you to come and consult for the organization or to help the organization. Why? Because while on the job, he was operating on the concave paradigm perspective, which led him into making decisions that focus on the short-term disadvantage. And that's why there has been many people out there, sad to say, who as a result of this paradigm have actually turned more like the trajectory of their life towards an area which they really wouldn't like. So it is important for one at every instance to examine the paradigm from which he or she is actually operating from and see how best to utilize or to cover the unique paradigm for himself or to operate from an optimal paradigm perspective so as to be able to position oneself towards sustainable success over the long period of time. Another scenario that comes to mind has to do with Theory guys who were actually going on an armed robbery operation. Here are Theory guys, they are going on an armed robbery operation. And now they have access to funds, they want to go and operate, I don't know, perhaps a bank or whatsoever. They were excited, A was excited, B was excited, C was excited. But C actually take a time backward and reflect on the decision which they want to engage in, and he realized the short-term disadvantage. What is the short-term disadvantage of this? First, he could be caught. The police could exchange could shot at them. He could from there die, that is death. Death could occur. He could be sent to jail. Or whatever it is, he begins to focus on what's the short-term disadvantage, what is the long-term disadvantage, what is the long-term advantage. But to A and B, because they were operating from optimal and concrete paradigm perspective, they really focus on the short-term disadvantage as well as the long-term disadvantage. And thus, he or she pulls back out of the operation because he chooses to want to operate. He has developed or prepared himself to operate from optimal paradigm perspective. And he chooses to turn out, and the other two people went, who knows, any of those disadvantages could actually happen. And before you realize it, there have been instances in which people, out of such decisions, they alter the trajectory of their life. Some spend lives behind the bar, within the cubicle, in which they were deprived their family, interactions with their families, and by the time they come out of jail, some might not be able to get their foot on the ground anymore, simply because they operate on their own paradigm, which isn't tailored towards sustainable success. So no doubt about the fact that the paradigm in which one operates from has a major role to play. So in day-to-day activities, one wants to examine his self and ask which paradigm is he actually operating from, and see how best to build a unique value-oriented paradigm that is operate from optimal paradigm. That's why you see today, majority of the great leaders out there, they are operating from optimal paradigm perspective, because over the time they've been able to come up with a unique paradigm which is associated with values. And one thing about optimal paradigm is the fact that it serves as anchor. Value has always served as anchor to optimal paradigm. So while trying to develop optimal paradigm, it is important for one to develop values, to be able to come up and see what are things that are valuable for me and what are things that are not valuable for me. And one should be able to see how best he utilize those valuable things. Those, I'll call it, things he associates with. Let's take, for instance, in these scenarios of the two accountants, accountant A might not associate anything value, might not associate value to honesty. While the second accountant B might associate value to honesty. And no doubt about the fact that, for the fact that he associates values to honesty, he won't be able to see how best he dealt honestly with his organization, because he would always have it in mind that the organization have to survive. I met this organization surviving, then I have to keep the pace. And if there's anything that could sabotage the organization, he is going to take it up as his own personal responsibility to block it out. And thus invariably, he is not only doing the organization a big favor, he is doing himself a big favor. But on the other way around, Mr. Hay, because he doesn't associate values to honesty, felt okay, he could go ahead and take advantage of the organization. But unknowingly to him, he's actually taking advantage of himself, because he wasn't operating from the optimal paradigm perspective. So that's why it's important at every instance to see how best we could develop a unique value toward things which are of significance that will be able to contribute to success over the long period of time. Also, of importance has to do with paradigm indicators, because while trying to build a unique value, or while trying to build a principle-oriented paradigm, it is important for one to examine which paradigm he or she is actually operating from. Because without that, one wouldn't be able to see how best to harness what needed to be harnessed, and how best to develop the right paradigm. That is, if I don't, let's take for instance, if I'm operating in any of the paradigms which are not optimal paradigm, I should be able to examine myself and see how best I can develop the optimal paradigm. And in order to do that, there are paradigm indicators, that is things that actually shows us on a day-to-day basis that these are the paradigms, or this is the paradigm from which I'm operating from. Let's take for instance values. I earlier mentioned what we associate values to as a major role to play in determining our paradigm. Let's take for instance, if I associate values to, trying as much as I can to seek external validation. Perhaps I want to do some certain things because it's going to boost my ego. In one way or the other, I may not be operating from from the right paradigm. Because in such instance, if there are needs for me to compromise honesty, I might have to compromise it in order to satisfy the external validation. So that's where value comes in. One wants to see what needed to be associated values to. So you want to see things you want to associate values to be things that are contributing towards sustainable success in every categories of life. And aside that, mission has a major role to play. What are the missions? What are my missions? That is, what is the mission for these decisions or for these actions? No doubt about the fact that the Mr. A has a mission for the decision which is made, which is engaging in, for the decision to siphon the organization's money. Mr. B as well has a mission. His own mission is to leave behind a legacy. He would like, okay, look, I want to leave a legacy, not only for myself, but for my future generations, for my kids. I want my kids to be proud of that he has a great dad. I wouldn't want my kids to feel bad because I didn't act honestly on the line of duty. So he has associated values to honesty and he has a mission. But to Mr. B, who has actually not associated values to honesty and as well has not been able to define his mission in a way that will sustain his success. He just realizes whatever it is that comes, then he goes with it. There are loopholes and he goes with it. So that's why it is important at every instance for one to examine himself to be sure that the paradigm in which he is operating from is the right paradigm that would sustain or project him in the path of sustainable success. Also, we have principles. Principles have a major role to play. And as I've earlier on said, it is important to see how best one have a paradigm that operates on principles. Because when there are no principles, in one way or the other, one could easily fall for things which ordinarily by default one wouldn't fall for should one have the right principles. So one wants to develop the right principles right away from onset. And aside that, one wants to associate value to things that are important, to things that would be able to help one achieve sustainable success over the long period of time. So what are your principles? You want to ask yourself, what are the principles that guide you in day-to-day life? As we proceed in the course of the course, we're going to highlight principles that would position one towards sustainable success over the long period of time. So but in the interim, it is important for one to examine his principles, the principles that guides one in day-to-day activities, and see how best those principles can be channeled, and see how best one can develop a principle that will position him or her towards the right path of sustainable success. Another thing is purpose. In life, generally, there are purpose for every living soul. Everyone has a purpose for existence. And thus, it is important for you to be able to ask yourself, what is my purpose? Because in major instances, when people don't carve out or so in major instances when people don't carve out or when they don't come up with a unique purpose for perhaps whatever it is they're doing in synchronizations with their life purpose, sort of realize they tend to get their sources sabotaged. What I mean is, like, take for instance the instance of the two scenarios we've been examining, the relation to the accountant. You realize that one might have been able to come up and say, okay, this is the purpose for which I want to live for. I want to have this purpose. I mean, this is my purpose for which I am created. And I want to believe nobody in the universe is created purposely for not being able to attain sustainable sources or for not being able to achieve sustainable sources. So you want to come up and identify your purpose for existence, that is, your purpose for the work you do. Nobody wants to build a career and purposely choose to sabotage the career because of the paradigm in which he operates from. Nobody would actually want to go right away from tender years, goes to school, acquire various certifications, be skillful when it comes to the job, but only to subject his or herself to paradigms which are tailored towards sustainable sources. So no doubt about the fact that purpose has a major role to play. Like I earlier mentioned in relation to the accountant B, you must have like, okay, I want to leave a legacy behind. And whatever it is I'm doing, I want to do it with the objective of contributing to my organization positively. And nobody wants to like, okay, come up, I want to build a career all along. And the best I want to do with this career, with all the certifications, with all the knowledge I've acquired, is to be able to contribute to my organization negatively. No, nobody comes up with that purpose. So that's why it's always important to see how best you come up with a purpose that is in synchronization with one's life purpose. Like the person, like the accountant B, in this instance, he must as well choosing that, okay, this is my life purpose. I mean, I want to be an accountant to be able to contribute positively to the organizations where I'm working with. And before you realize it, he will be contributing values there. And even while he leaves such an organization, he would leave a good legacy behind. And that's why most of the top great leaders within our society today, when you examine their track record, you realize that they've always operated from optimal paradigm perspective. And that's why people in major instances often goes back to them in order to seek some needed guidelines, to seek some needed counsel, to be able to keep making progress in their respective organizations or in their respective aspect of life. Another interesting thing is results. You want to examine your results on a daily basis. Over the period of time, if one is actually been focusing on the short-term disadvantage or on the short-term advantage of any decision which he or she makes, no doubt about the fact that results will always show that the person has always been focusing on the short-term advantage. And before you realize it, when the long-term comes, the long-term disadvantage will surely surface. So one wants to see how best he or she positions, one wants to see how best he or she utilize or examine long-term disadvantage and as well as long-term disadvantage of whatever decision he or she is making. And one thing about paradigm is the fact that it has a major role in altering or in affecting one's, not only one's actions, but as well one's thought. So when you talk of optimal paradigm, when you talk of paradigm generally, it all springs up from thought, that is, which one can actually influence. That is, your thought, if your thought is actually not tailored towards the optimal paradigm, you want to ensure that your thought process is tailored towards the optimal paradigm. Because in the real sense, those are some of the things which will have control over in shaping one's life and as well shaping one's values. Having mentioned that, now let's talk about principal paradigm foundations. There are some things we need to get rooted before one could actually build or allows. There are foundations towards which optimal paradigm thrives. Without the right foundations, one would not be able to thrive with the optimal paradigms. Take for instance, self-awareness. Self-awareness has a major role to play when it comes to building the right paradigm or living from optimal paradigm perspective. And that has to do with you being able to honestly examine yourself and tell yourself the bitter truth. Because one thing I've come to realize is the fact that not everyone has this ability, or unless the ability to be able to do a self-confrontation, that is, to be able to tell his or herself the bitter truth in some instances. Take for instance, if you are not doing fine, let's assume someone is operating from concrete paradigm perspective, the person should be able to honestly tell his or herself, okay, look, based on the results which I've been getting, based on my paradigm indicator, I think I'm a little bit lacking behind and I need to do something about it before it's too late. Not everybody has been able to harness that ability to be able to tell his or herself, okay, I'm not doing fine. Usually the major instances we tend to give ourselves some reasons for not operating from optimal paradigm perspective until things get out of hand and we realize the paradigm has actually not served the best, most especially in instances where one builds careers to the point whereby he allows the principled paradigm to actually sabotage his efforts. So you want to ask yourself, first, what's the paradigm in which you are operating from? If you are operating from concrete paradigm perspective, I think it's something nice for you to be able to understand and come to the realization that this is the paradigm you are operating from. And all you just have to do is take a step further at solitude, come up with your mechanism for building the right foundation toward which the optimal paradigm will be able to thrive. And if it is convex paradigm as well, on the other way around, you want to as well examine yourself and come up with, and be able to tell yourself the honest truth, the bitter truth, and be honest with yourself that, look, I think I'm not doing fine in this regard. And from there, you're taking the first step towards building the right paradigm. Because self-awareness has to do with you being able to understand yourself in areas of thoughts, in areas of emotions. Your thoughts, your emotions, your actions, you should be able to understand yourself. It requires self-awareness for one to be able to understand his or her thoughts, his or her emotions, and lastly, his or her actions. Because not until one understands his thought process, his emotion, as well as his actions, he might not be able to allow the optimal paradigm. He might not be able to operate from optimal paradigm perspective. And that's where the internal works needs to be done. That is, one being able to look inward and examine his paradigm indicators. Also, values has a major role to play. And as I earlier on mentioned, what one associates values to has a major role to play. So you want to see what are the things you associate values to. If you've been associating values to external validations, that is, okay, these are things that are prevalent perhaps within your society, and you don't have the means to sustain those things, but you just want to live up to external expectations, then in one way or the other, you might be sabotaging yourself. You might not be living from an optimal paradigm perspective. Or in situations whereby you take a time to look inward and associate values to things which are important and which has to do with your internal congruence, your purpose, your missions, your values, everything are in sync. And then before you realize it, you're building the foundations for optimal paradigm perspective. And another thing is conscience. Conscience has a major role to play when it comes to building the right foundations. One thing I've come to realize is the fact that there are instances in which many often subject conscience to randomness. And when conscience is being subjected to randomness, then by default, in one way or the other, sources might as well be subjected to randomness. This is what I mean. In the issue of, in high-headed scenario of two accountants, in which one was actually operating from optimal paradigm and the other one was actually operating from the non-optimal paradigm perspective, you realize that Mr. B must have done much more of an internal work and making the conscience or training the conscience to be able to assign what is good and what is bad to right away from the conscience. Here is the conscience, right there. And the conscience is tailored towards being able to determine if something is good or if something is bad. But in scenario where Mr. A has actually not told the conscience that, look, honesty is good, honesty is bad. By default, the conscience would randomly select if it's good or bad, and that would have a major role to play in Mr. A's paradigm outlook. But in situation where Mr. B has actually trained the conscience to see honesty as something good. Now, in the course of the thought process, when the thought, even when there are loopholes within his organization, and the thought comes in, the conscience, which is in sync with the thought, would tell the person, look, this thing, is in contrary to honesty. We should assign it conscience to be, we should assign to be good, to be bad. But the conscience, because when you are not dealing honestly, the conscience will tell you that, look, you're treading in the wrong path. But in scenarios where one doesn't assign these things to the conscience might not be able to ascertain what is good and what is bad. So that's why in major instances, even when people are not doing what is good, when they are acting dishonestly, they feel they're doing something good. Why? Because they've actually not trained the conscience to be able to see what is bad as bad and what is good as good. So when trying to build the foundations for principled paradigm, it is important for one to be able to build, to train the conscience in relation to thought. And during the thought process, even when the conscience when the thought is telling you that this thing is good, and the conscience is telling you it's bad. During the course of emotions, because sometimes after thought there are emotions. The emotions you associate to things as a major role to play. And during the emotional stage, the conscience as well will tell you that this thing is bad. But because you've actually trained the conscience to say, okay, this thing is bad, if you fail if the thought fails, the conscience, if you fail the thought in the thought process, in the emotional process, the thought conscience as well will tell you. And now, in the action stage, the conscience as well will tell you. So what you want to do here is you want to try as many as you can, right away from the thought process, assign what is good to your conscience. Tell your conscience what is actually good and what is actually bad. And you want to associate your emotions as well. Take for instance, in the area of honesty, emotions to things that are good, honesty to good. Then in emotions, anything that is not honest, you want to assign it to bad. And in the course of the action as well, while Mr. B or Mr. A is carrying out that action, his own conscience must have told him, okay, because he has actually not trained that conscience, the conscience will by default assign it to something good. Because right in the thought, in the emotions, in the actions, Mr. A has actually not assigned such dealings to what is bad or to what is good. So by default, the conscience might, even if the conscience wants to this thing is bad, the conscience, it could actually override and say, okay, this thing is good. And thus focusing on the immediate benefit without considering the long-term disadvantage as well as the short-term disadvantage. But Mr. A, right away from his thought process, he could shut out that thought that, okay, this thing is bad, because he has trained the conscience to always say things like that as bad. And let's assume in the thought process there was failure. Then the second stage, which is the emotional stage, that's more like a 2 or 3 step authentication in this regard. The conscience would okay, this thing is bad. The emotions would okay, this thing is bad. That's why you see some people, they feel down, especially when thoughts or things that are bad comes to mind, they feel bad about it. And immediately from that emotions, they can actually turn back. But to those who have actually not assigned things of such to their conscience, they proceed right straight to the actions. And before you realize it, they invariably make decisions that alter the trajectory of their career, their life, and all of this. So no doubt about the fact that building the right principles has a major role to play. I mean, building the right principle has major role to play with the foundation. So one wants to see how Bexley gets the foundations right. And as I've earlier mentioned, values as well has a major role to play, because values is more like an anchor. Values is more like an anchor to principled paradigm. When you talk of principled paradigm, you can't talk of the in outside of values. So you want to see how best you utilize the values, your self-awareness, as well as conscience towards building the right foundations for principled-oriented paradigm, which as well it's paradigm from which as well can be described as optimal paradigm. Last but not the least as well is the endowment. Every human creation has an endowment, as I've earlier mentioned, because Jehovah God, created each and every one of us with a purpose, with an endowment, that is our ability. And sadly, there are instances in which people don't take time to do the internal work to examine what are their endowment. There are a lot of people who are talented and they don't recognize this. While there are some people as well who are talented, they know about it, but they really can't utilize or harness that endowment in a way that will help them to be able to attain sustainable success. So you want to ask yourself, what are your endowments? What are the things you are good at? And the moment you get your self-awareness right, and you get your values right, you get your conscience trained right, and you get your endowment right, no doubt about the fact that you combine all this and use it to build a very great foundations towards which optimal paradigms would actually thrive. So thank you so much. Here we have comes to the conclusion of this first part of our short course on principle-oriented paradigm. So we shall proceed to the second part of the course, and until then, I'd like to say thank you for your time and thank you for the opportunity or the privilege. Thank you for your time. That's all.